If I told you that the modern world, every phone in your pocket, every car on the road, every cup of coffee on your table was not built by presidents, generals, or visionary inventors, you might laugh it off as exaggeration. If I told you that the real architects of globalization were not governments, but a small circle of shipping barons who quietly seized control of the oceans, you might assume I was spinning a conspiracy theory. And if I told you that this group has dominated global trade for more than 150 years, crushing competitors, dictating prices, and extracting tribute from nearly every nation on earth, all while operating legally, openly, and with government approval, you would probably ask a far more disturbing question: why have we never been taught this story? Because this is not a tale of secret cults meeting in underground bunkers or shadowy figures plotting world domination in the dark. This empire does not hide. It sails in plain sight. Its power glides silently into your ports, stacked high with steel containers, waving national flags and corporate logos. And yet, it controls the arteries of the global economy with a grip tighter than any old cartel, any tech monopoly, or any financial syndicate you've ever heard of. This is the story of an industry that decided long ago that the only way to save capitalism was to destroy competition itself. An industry that convinced the most powerful governments on earth that monopoly was not a crime, but a necessity, that without cartel control, the global economy would not merely become inefficient, it would collapse into chaos. Today, we're going to dismantle that argument piece by piece. We're going to trace how a handful of shipping companies transformed the open seas into private territory, how they learned to turn crisis into profit, scarcity into leverage, and global dependence into permanent power, and to understand why your cost of living is exploding today, why inflation feels untouchable, why supply chains seem fragile, and why no government seems able or willing to intervene. We have to go back, not to Washington, not to Wall Street, but to a suffocating room in colonial-era Kolkata in the year 1875. But before we travel back to the moment this empire was born, we need to examine the crime scene in our own time, because the proof of this invisible empire didn't emerge in the 19th century. It revealed itself when the world stopped moving. Do you remember the early days of the pandemic? Do you remember that eerie silence when the world seemed to power down all at once? Factories went dark, ports clogged, flights vanished from the sky. Small businesses, many built over generations, collapsed in a matter of weeks. Millions of people lost their jobs, their savings, and in many cases, their sense of security about the future. Governments called it an unprecedented economic shock. Households called it survival mode. But while the world was bleeding, one industry was quietly executing what may be the greatest corporate heist in modern history. In 2021 alone, the global container shipping industry generated an estimated $190 billion in profit, not revenue, profit. To understand how obscene that number is, you need context. Between 2010 and 2020, the entire industry barely stayed afloat. A full decade of razor-thin margins, frequent losses, bankruptcies, and government bailouts. Shipping was considered a dull, low-margin utility business essential. But, and glamorous, investors avoided it, analysts mocked it. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. In a single year, shipping companies made nearly 5 times more profit than they had made in the entire previous decade combined. More than Apple, more than Saudi Aramco, more than many of the banks that dominate global finance. And they did it without inventing anything new. Before the pandemic, but as lockdowns ended and consumer demand roared back to life, that price didn't merely increase, it detonated. By late 2021, the spot price for that same steel box surged past $15,000. In extreme cases, it touched $20,000, a tenfold increase. A tax imposed not by governments, but by companies levied on every refrigerator, every sofa, every phone, Every toy shipped across the ocean. And what did the world get in return for this premium? Faster ships? Better service? More reliability? No. Ships were delayed for weeks. Containers piled up in ports. Goods rotted on docks. Supply chains snapped under the strain. Reliability collapsed to historic lows. The shipping giants looked at the chaos and shrugged. They blamed the virus. They blamed truck drivers. They blamed congested ports. They blamed unprecedented demand. And they insisted calmly, confidently, that this was simply the invisible hand of supply and demand doing its work. But the numbers told a very different story. For decades, shipping companies had operated on margins of 3 to 4%. Suddenly, those margins exploded to over 50%. This wasn't inflation. This wasn't bad luck. This was price extraction on a planetary scale. The situation became so blatant that even political leaders, who normally avoid confrontation with multinational corporations, were forced to respond. In June 2021, President Joe Biden stood before the cameras, visibly frustrated, and ordered a federal investigation into the shipping industry. He publicly acknowledged what exporters and retailers had been screaming for months. The ocean was no longer free market. It was controlled by three massive alliances, a small triumvirate that commanded more than 80% of global container capacity in Europe. The backlash was just as intense. The exporters accused shipping lines of holding global trade hostage. Politicians, journalists, and business leaders began using words that were once considered taboo in polite economic conversation: cartel, monopoly, mafia. The public demanded action: break them up, restore competition, destroy the monsters. But just as the anger reached its peak, a quieter, more unsettling voice emerged from economists, historians, and even regulators themselves. They warned that what people were asking for might be far worse than what they already had, that if governments actually succeeded in breaking the shipping cartel, the result wouldn't be cheaper goods and smoother trade. It would be chaos, a level of instability that would make the supply chain crisis of 2021 look like a minor inconvenience. And to understand why the United States and Europe have tolerated this monopoly for over a century, we have to understand the disease at the heart of the shipping industry. A disease that makes normal competition impossible, a disease that was discovered long before the pandemic ever began. At this point, the outrage feels obvious. If three alliances control most of the world's shipping capacity, if prices exploded, all service collapsed, if exporters, importers, and consumers are all paying the price, then why don't governments do what they've done before? Why not break them up, the same way the United States broke Standard Oil, the railroads, or the telecom monopolies? Why not unleash competition and let the free market do what it's supposed to do? The answer is uncomfortable because shipping is not a normal industry. And the moment governments tried to apply normal free market logic to the ocean, everything fell apart. To understand why, we have to leave the modern world behind and return to the late 19th century, a period that mirrors our own more closely than we might like to admit. It was an age of technological acceleration. Old systems were collapsing. New machines were rewriting the rules of economics faster than societies could adapt. And in the span of just a few decades, two breakthroughs shattered the ancient logic of maritime trade. The first was the perfection of the steam engine. For thousands of years, global commerce had been hostage to the wind. Ships drifted at the mercy of weather patterns. A voyage from London to Bombay could take 3 months or 6 depending on the mood of the ocean. Trade was slow, expensive, and unreliable. Steam changed everything. Ships no longer needed favorable winds. They could move in straight lines. They could follow schedules. They could be built larger, heavier, and faster than anything that had come before. For the first time in history, the ocean became predictable. The second breakthrough was even more dramatic. In 1869, the opening of the Suez Canal sliced the distance between Europe and Asia nearly in half. The long, treacherous journey around the tip of Africa was replaced by a shortcut carved through the desert. On paper, this was a golden age. Shipping became cheaper, trade expanded, globalization accelerated. But, beneath the surface, these miracles created an economic catastrophe. The efficiency gains were too large. Too fast, a steamship could now complete 3 round trips in the time it once took a sailing ship. To make one, the effective supply of shipping capacity exploded almost overnight. It was as if someone had opened 100 massive supermarkets on a street that only had enough customers to support 10. The result wasn't healthy competition, it was a massacre. Shipping rates didn't gradually decline, they collapsed. Companies slashed prices in desperation, undercutting one another just to keep their ships moving. Cargo was carried at a loss, revenues evaporated. Bankruptcies rippled through the great port cities of the era. London, Liverpool, Hamburg. The free market, unleashed without restraint, was destroying the very infrastructure that global trade depended on. This wasn't competition driving innovation, it was a race to the bottom where everyone was winning by losing. By the mid-1870s, the industry was bleeding to death, and that's when the captains of the shipping world made a decision that would permanently alter the structure of global capitalism. In August of 1875, while most of the world went about its business unaware, a small group of men gathered in a stifling room in the port city of Kolkata. There were no headlines, no speeches, no official records meant for public eyes. These men were not kings or politicians. They were the owners of steamships, the men who controlled the lifeline between Britain and its most valuable colony, India. For years, they had been locked in a brutal price war on the UK-India route. Every voyage became a gamble. Every cargo, a desperate attempt to steal business from a rival by charging just a little less. They were tired of fighting the ocean. They were tired of fighting merchants. And then they realized something far more dangerous. Their real enemy wasn't outside the room. It was sitting across the table. Someone finally asked the question that would reshape global trade. Why are we destroying ourselves fighting over scraps when we could agree to feast together? Out of that realization, the Kolkata Conference was born. To the public, it was framed as a harmless professional association, a group dedicated to improving safety, coordination, and reliability on a vital trade route. But, behind closed doors, it was something far more consequential. It was the world's first modern shipping cartel. The members agreed to stop competing on price entirely. They set uniform freight rates, carefully calculated to guarantee healthy profits for everyone involved. They coordinated schedules so ships wouldn't arrive at the same ports at the same time, avoiding internal rivalry. In one stroke, a chaotic market was transformed into a disciplined oligopoly. The brilliance of the system lay in its simplicity, and like all effective ideas rooted in self-interest, it spread rapidly within decades. Similar conferences appeared on nearly every major trade route on Earth. The term was polite, respectable, and deliberately misleading. A conference sounded civilized. In reality, it was a cartel. By the early 20th century, more than 360 shipping conferences controlled global maritime trade. The Far Eastern Freight Conference dominated Eurasia routes. The Transatlantic Conference ruled trade with the Americas. The world's oceans were carved up like territory on a map. This route is yours, that route is mine. Stay in your lane, and we all get rich. But agreeing on prices was only the beginning, because in a system built on greed, temptation never disappears. There was always the risk that a cartel member would cheat, that they'd secretly offer a lower rate to steal a lucrative customer, and there was an even greater threat. What if an outsider, an independent operator, entered the market and undercut them? All to maintain their grip on the oceans. The shipping conferences needed more than agreements, they needed enforcement, and what they built next would make organized crime look amateurish. The shipping conferences understood a brutal truth: agreements mean nothing without enforcement. If left unchecked, greed would tear the cartel apart from the inside. Someone would always be tempted to cheat, and sooner or later, An outsider would attempt to break in, so instead of relying on trust, the cartel engineered a system of economic warfare so effective that it eliminated competition before it could even take its first breath. Their first weapon was predatory pricing. Perfected into an art form, they called it the fighting ship. Imagine you are an ambitious, independent entrepreneur in the late 19th century. You scrape together capital, buy a ship, and decide to challenge the cartel on a major route, say, London to Hong Kong. You study the numbers. You see the cartel's inflated rates and realize you can offer prices 20% lower and still turn a profit. It looks like an opportunity. But the moment your ship docks, the cartel responds. They deploy a fighting ship, a vessel whose sole purpose is to follow you wherever you go. When your ship arrives in port, the fighting ship docks right beside it, and then the price war begins. The fighting ship offers to carry the same cargo for half the price you're charging. Sometimes, they offer to carry it for free. At first glance, it seems irrational. How can they afford this? The answer is simple. They can't on that shit. The fighting ship is a suicide mission, hemorrhaging money with every mile. But it doesn't need to be profitable. Its losses are subsidized by monopoly profits generated across dozens of other routes. The cartel can afford to lose money indefinitely. You cannot. With one ship and a bank loan, you bleed dry within weeks. Your creditors call. Your ship is seized. It's sold for scrap, and the moment you're gone, the fighting ship vanishes. Rates snap back to monopoly levels. The lesson is clear. No independent competitor survives long enough to become a threat. But the cartel didn't stop there. What if the enemy wasn't a small operator, but a coalition of powerful merchants? What if customers themselves tried to break free? For that, the cartel developed its most insidious tool, the deferred rebate system. On paper, it looked generous. A shipping conference would approach a merchant, a tea exporter in Ceylon, a textile manufacturer in Manchester, and make an offer. Ship exclusively with us, they said, and we'll return 10% of your freight costs at the end of the year. For businesses operating on thin margins, this was irresistible. But there was a catch. The rebate wouldn't be paid immediately. It would be deferred, held back for 6 months, sometimes longer. And if, at any point during that period, the merchant shipped even a single crate with a competitor, the entire accumulated rebate would be forfeited. The merchant was always owed money. Leaving the cartel meant abandoning profits they had already earned, even if a competitor offered lower rates. Switching became financial suicide. The customer base was effectively privatized. Finally, to prevent conflict within the cartel itself, the conferences introduced pooling. Instead of each company keeping what it earned, all revenue from a route was poured into a central pool. At the end of the year, profits were divided according to pre-agreed percentages. It didn't matter who carried more cargo. It didn't matter who invested in better ships. Everyone got paid the same. Competition inside the cartel was extinguished completely. It was, as critics would later describe it, socialism for capitalists, a system that guaranteed survival and comfort regardless of performance. By the early 20th century, the shipping conferences had achieved something unprecedented. They had eliminated price competition, locked in customers, crushed outsiders, and neutralized internal greed. They didn't just dominate the market, they owned it, which raises the question that infuriated reformers for generations: how was any of this legal? By the early 20th century, anger toward the shipping conferences was boiling over. Merchants accused them of extortion. Politicians called them parasites. Journalists described them as legalized rackets. And yet, despite investigations, hearings, and public outrage, nothing changed. Not in Britain, not in the United States, not in Europe. At the very moment when governments were breaking up oil trusts, railroad monopolies, and banking syndicates, the shipping cartels were quietly given a pass. The question haunted reformers for decades: why was shipping different? The answer lies in one of the most counterintuitive and unsettling ideas in economics: the empty core. To understand it, you have to understand the terrifying economics of the sea. Shipping is an industry defined by massive sunk costs. To enter the market, you must invest enormous sums upfront. Today, it's billions of dollars. In the 19th century, it was still ruinously expensive. Once a ship is built, that money is gone locked into steel, engines, and hulls. But once the ship exists, the cost of operating it is relatively fixed. It costs almost the same to sail a ship full as it does to sail it half empty. Fuel, crew wages, maintenance, these expenses barely change. This creates a lethal incentive when there are too many ships and not enough cargo, a condition known as overcapacity. Every shipping line panics. Carrying a container for $1 is better than carrying nothing at all, and so, in a free market, companies slash prices in desperation. Rates plunge toward marginal cost, which in shipping is effectively zero, but that's zero revenue. No company can service its debt. Bankruptcies follow. Ships are scrapped. Capacity disappears. Then the pendulum swings. Suddenly there aren't enough ships. Prices skyrocket. Investors rush in, order new vessels, and overbill once again. Boom, bust, boom, bust. This cycle is not theoretical. It happened repeatedly in the 19th century, and every time it did, global trade suffered. Factories depend on predictability. A manufacturer needs to know that a ship will arrive next month and roughly how much it will cost. If shipping lines collapse every few years, supply chains fracture. Governments studied the problem. Britain investigated in 1909. The United States followed in 1912. And they all reached the same conclusion. Open competition in shipping was impossible. The Alexander Committee in the U.S. Congress stated bluntly in 1914 that free market competition on the seas would lead to instability worse than monopoly pricing. So in 1916, the United States made a decision that still echoes today. With the Shipping Act of 1916, it granted shipping conferences broad immunity from antitrust laws. The cartel was legalized, not because it was moral, not because it was fair, but because the alternative was chaos. Governments decided it was better to be robbed by a stable monopoly than to rely on a free market that might not deliver the goods at all. For most of the 20th century, this uneasy bargain held. The shipping conferences kept rates high, but they delivered reliability. They built the fleets that carried the coal, steel, and grain that constructed the modern world. But as the century turned, cracks began to appear. By the late 20th century, the old system was under pressure. The shipping conferences that had dominated global trade for generations were beginning to look outdated. Their gentlemanly clubs, handwritten agreements, and rigid structures struggled to keep up with a rapidly changing world. Then came containerization. In the 1960s and 1970s, the humble shipping container transformed global trade more profoundly than any inventions since the steam engine. Goods could now move seamlessly from factories to trucks, trains, and ships without ever being unpacked, but containers required enormous investment. New ships, new ports, new cranes, new logistics systems. The old European conferences moved slowly. They hesitated, they debated, and in that hesitation, new challengers emerged, aggressive, capital-hungry players from Asia. Companies like Evergreen and Maersk built massive fleets, modern terminals, and integrated networks that dwarfed the old system. Competition intensified, and then the regulators stepped in. In 2008, after years of political pressure and legal battles, the European Union abolished the block exemption that had allowed shipping conferences to fix prices legally. The United States followed with similar reforms. On paper, it was a historic victory. The cartel was dead. Price fixing was illegal. The free market had finally triumphed. Regulators congratulated themselves, but the shipping companies understood something the regulators didn't. The laws had changed. The economics had not. The empty core problems still existed: massive fixed costs, volatile demand, the constant threat of destructive competition. If shipping lines truly competed on price, they would all bleed to death, so they adapted. They stopped calling them conferences, they started calling them alliances. Instead of openly fixing prices which would now land executives in prison, they formed vast operational partnerships. They shared ships, routes, terminals, and schedules. They went to regulators with a simple, seductive argument. If one company has a half-empty ship sailing to Shanghai, and another has a half-empty ship going to the same port, why waste fuel and emit carbon by running both? Why not consolidate cargo onto a single vessel? It's more efficient, it's cheaper, it's better for the environment. The logic was flawless, and the regulators agreed. What they approved, however, was the most effective rebranding of monopoly power in modern history today. Instead of hundreds of competing companies, the global ocean is dominated by three massive alliances: the 2M Alliance, the Ocean Alliance, and the Alliance. Together, they control over 80% of the world's container shipping capacity. On critical routes like Asia to the United States, that figure climbs closer to 90%. It is an oligopoly more concentrated than the cartels of the 19th century, and far more disciplined. What happened next was not an accident, it was not a perfect storm, it was not bad luck, and it was certainly not the invisible hand of the free market. It was tacit collusion, the highest, cleanest, and most sophisticated form of cartel behavior. Here's how it works. In a traditional cartel, companies meet in smoky rooms and explicitly agree on prices. That's illegal now. But in tacit collusion, no one ever says the quiet part out loud. Everyone simply watches everyone else. If demand weakens, a rational competitor would normally lower prices to fill capacity. But in shipping, lowering prices is suicide. So instead, the alliances discovered a far more elegant weapon: blank sailings. A blank sailing is exactly what it sounds like. A scheduled ship simply doesn't sail. No dramatic announcement, no press conference, just absence. If demand drops 10%, the alliance cancels 10% of sailings, capacity disappears, prices stay high. And because all the major players belong to alliances, they all move in lockstep without ever signing a piece of paper that says we agree. No meeting, no contract, no evidence, just perfectly synchronized behavior. To regulators, it looks like independent decision-making. To economists, it looks like efficiency. To shippers, it feels like extortion. And then came 2020, when COVID hit. Global trade collapsed almost overnight. Factories shut down, ports emptied, demand fell off a cliff. In any competitive market, prices would have crashed. Instead, shipping lines did something unprecedented. They slashed capacity faster than demand fell. Hundreds of sailings were blanked, ships were idled, containers vanished. By late 2020, when demand roared back, driven by stimulus checks and a lockdown world buying everything online, the system was already primed. There were too few ships, too few containers, too little slack, and the alliances did not rush to add capacity. Why would they? Rates exploded. The cost to ship a container from Shanghai to Los Angeles didn't double, it didn't triple, it increased tenfold, from around $1,500 to over $15,000 per container. Shipping companies posted profits so large they broke accounting records. Maersk made more money in 1 year than it had made in the previous decade combined. Executives called it operational excellence. Politicians called it unexpected. Small businesses called it bankruptcy. Consumers paid the bill quietly, invisibly embedded in the price of everything from couches to Christmas lights. And the most remarkable part? It was all legal. No cartel agreements, no price-fixing memos, no antitrust convictions, just alliances, just capacity management, just the same logic that has ruled shipping since the age of sail. When the public finally noticed what was happening, the damage was already done. Inflation was surging, shelves were empty, small importers were collapsing, and one industry sat quietly at the center of it all, recording the greatest profits in its history. Politicians were suddenly furious. In Washington, lawmakers summoned shipping executives to hearings filled with theatrical outrage. They demanded explanations for price hikes that had already reshaped the global economy. Executives arrived armed with spreadsheets and lawyers. They blamed congestion. They blamed labor shortages. They blamed COVID. They blamed consumers for buying too much, and technically, they weren't lying, but they weren't telling the truth either. The core problem wasn't chaos, it was control. For decades, regulators had approved consolidation in the name of efficiency. Each merger shaved costs, each alliance reduced waste, each exemption was justified as temporary and harmless. Together, they created something no one could unwind. By 2021, the top 10 shipping companies controlled more than 85% of global container capacity. Breaking them up would mean disrupting global trade itself. Regulators were trapped. If they cracked down too hard, supply chains would freeze, ports would seize up, prices would spike even higher. If they did nothing, the alliances would continue printing money, so they did what regulators often do when faced with structural power they no longer control. They scolded, they threatened, they proposed studies. In the United States, Congress passed the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022. It promised tougher oversight and better protections for exporters. In practice, it changed very little. The alliances remained intact, blank sailings continued, capacity discipline became the new normal, and then something even more revealing happened. As demand cooled in 2023 and 2024, prices didn't crash the way textbooks predicted. They drifted down slowly, gently, never returning to pre-COVID levels. The cartel had learned its lesson. Never flood the market again. The empty core had been solved, not by competition, but by coordination. This story is not really about shipping. Shipping is just the purest example. It's about what happens when industries with massive fixed costs collide with unpredictable demand. Airlines, telecommunications, semiconductors, energy grids, every one of them faces the same brutal logic. Compete honestly and risk mutual destruction. Coordinate quietly and survive. The shipping industry didn't defeat capitalism, it perfected it, by obeying the letter of the law while violating its spirit, by replacing cartels with alliances, price fixing with capacity management, smoke-filled rooms with spreadsheets and algorithms. The empty core still rules, and it always will. Because as long as moving a box across the ocean costs billions to enable land, pennies to marginally add competition will never behave the way you thought it should. The final irony? Consumers still believe shipping is cheap. After all, ATV only costs a few dollars to ship. They never see the tax. It's hidden everywhere in higher prices and fragile supply chains. In a global economy permanently optimized for control rather than resilience, the cartel didn't disappear, it just learned how to dress like a market.